I thought this quote here would be perfect to open up the discussion with. It's a quote from Epictetus's Discourses, and it's the very beginning. So if you look at book 1, chapter 1, he opens up with this, and this is the beginning of the chapter, and this is the end of it. But it's interesting that he basically opens up his entire discourses. The very first thing is about desire and attachment. It's very important to him that this is the case. As then it was fit to be so, that which is best of all and supreme over all is the only thing which the gods have placed in our power, which is the right use of appearances. You can call this judgment as well, right use of appearances or judgments. This it is to have studied what a man ought to study, to have made desire, aversion, free from hindrance, and free from all that a man would avoid. And then he ends, I really like it. I find this a bit amusing, but also really telling for Stoic philosophy. He says, I must die if now I am ready to die. So it's, I'll open it up to the floor. What do you guys make of this quote and the importance that Epictetus gives to this managing desire and aversion? Because he ends this quote so starkly that if he has to die, so be it, so long as he's mastered the art of desire and aversion. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can see if anybody's hand is raised. Yeah, but would anybody like to comment on that, on Epictetus's quote, and especially his importance he attributes to desire and aversion? And if that's correct, is that the fundamental goal of living a good life, of having good character? Could you die comfortably knowing that you've mastered desire and aversion?
Steph, do you mind sharing the quote in the chat so we can continue to read it?
Yeah, of course. If I could ask, could everybody please just mute their mics while they're not speaking? I'm hearing a little bit of background static. Thanks. Yeah, Gonzalo.
Kind of like this quote reminds me, I'm not sure if the words are used in the same way though. Kind of like one of my Zen teacher, kind of like one of the first things that he tried to teach us was related to learning to differentiate between attachment and aversion, or in Spanish is adversión, which I think that it's aversion. He mentioned two really simple definitions for each one of them. He mentioned that attachment was to give positive characteristics to something that naturally doesn't have them, and aversion to be giving negative characteristic to something that naturally doesn't have it. So kind of like I talked with him a lot in this subject, because like, when he threw the bomb, I was like, what do you mean by that? a lot of confusion for me. And he basically, you kind of like, you end up with this thing where you said like, you can feel more things of the things that you said. I like doing this, and then you kind of like, you're granting power to that thing that you want, and that you're desiring, right? But when you remove that I like to do this, kind of like, it loses a little bit of power. So I think that for me, and also the same thing for the negative things, when you say, I hate that this is happening to me, or whatever, I'm thinking in a situation. So you kind of like, if you remove that and you say something like, oh, this is really inconvenient, or something a little bit down in tone, you kind of like get this a little bit less of negative suffering or kind of like pain for having to run through that situation. And I'm guessing that if you practice that enough, it will kind of like help you to carry on until your death, learning that you have accepted the things as they have come, right? But kind of like it brings that to my mind. I'm not really sure if that's entirely related or not.
I'm not sure, and it's not like the Stoics had a textbook. Maybe they did. Maybe it's lost to history, but I'm pretty sure there's no strict definition of aversion and attachment. There's just a few different interpretations academics have of their works. But I think you generally have it correct. What would I had another thought in mind, but I think I should maybe say something first. But it's what would be the fine line between attachment and preference? I think the Stoics' great contribution, I think Buddhism has this parallel of focusing on aversion and attachment and trying to detach from externals, just like the Stoics. But I think the Stoics, for me, one of my favorite Stoics' contribution is that they consider certain things that you may want or desire, but not necessarily get attached to, are preferences or preferred indifference, externals that you prefer to have, but you're not necessarily attached to them. But I wonder if anybody has a good way of explaining, maybe intuitively, just on the fly, or something they can take from experience, like a good example where they can find a good distinction between attachment and simply preferring something. Kind of two sides of the same coin of desire. Attachment, I think, could definitely be that that negative side, and preference is something we would prefer to have. Preference is something we prefer to have. Alvaro.
Yeah, just to frame it within the Stoic framework, I believe there are some goods that are basically absolute goods. So in this case, it would be virtues such as wisdom, courage, and so on. And then there are some goods that are, you will put them in the category of preferred or dispreferred. I think all goods are preferred and evils are the ones that are dispreferred. So something of that sort will be health. So health, it's not something that is affecting your virtue. So if you lack health, it's obviously something that maybe you will not prefer to be lacking health. You will prefer to be healthy, but that is not affecting you as a virtuous person, or you lacking any of the virtues such as courage, temperance, and so on. So I hope I didn't confuse you guys, but I just wanted to frame it within the Stoic framework.
I'll come back to your point, but I first wanted to bounce over to Natalia.
Hi, so I wanted to say that difference between attachment and preference becomes clear when the things do not go the way you want to go. For example, if you're attached to wealth, if you lose all the money you have, you're unhappy, your tranquility is disturbed. But if you just prefer being wealthy, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really affect you much if you lose all the wealth.
Thank you for that. Actually, that was I see a lot of hands raised, so I'll go in order in which I think I've tracked them. The only thing I like to point out, because there's something subtle about the Stoics, Alvaro said I needed to point out. But I really like that Natalia pointed out that the only way in which you could really know if you prefer something or are attached to it is when you actually come to that point of encountering it, right? I think maybe an extreme example was the death of a loved one, or a simple example might be the the leftover food you put in your refrigerator. Really mundane, boring example, but let's just, you can go with whatever you want. And then let's say when it doesn't go your way, like you were saying, how it defeats your expectations, how you respond to it emotionally or reasonably is, I think, a good signal as to if you were ever attached to it or simply preferred it. The only thing I'd like to comment about Alvaro's way of explaining goods or evils is that the Stoics didn't think that there was nothing else good besides the virtues. I mean, you could disagree with this, and that's fine. But the Stoics thought that there was no such thing as goods besides the four virtues. Things like health or wealth were not goods; they were indifference. They were things that you were neither good nor evil, and things you would prefer, but shouldn't upset you if you didn't have. I think the same thing about evils. They didn't think there was anything particularly evil in the world besides the opposite of virtues, like ignorance, greed, and so forth. For example, disease and war weren't evils to the Stoics. They were things that were you kind of have to face without getting upset about. Just a point I wanted to point out, I think it's just also really important to understand where the Stoics are coming from in terms of indifference. But I also really enjoyed the fact that you brought up virtues, because it is really important that virtues should be the only thing that I guess we are attached to, if you can really be attached to them. I think I saw Gonzalo's hand up first, then Jack's, then Adi's. So I'm going to go in that direction. Oh, your mic.
Yeah, I'm searching something, so I prefer to pass to the next one until I find the thing that I'm searching. Sorry.
Okay, Jack.
Yeah, I'm curious. So I'm new to Stoicism, and I am curious where this concept of like attachment and preference, the idea that you can have externals you prefer to have but are not attached to, which Stoic references that and what material, and related. So I have gone a little bit through Rufus's translated by Cynthia King. And here he says, a person who lives extravagantly cannot help but spend a lot and therefore cannot want to spend little. Furthermore, because he wants many things, he can't refrain from trying to acquire them. When he sets out to acquire them, he can't help grabbing for too much and being unjust. And so this is the important part. No one can acquire many things without being unjust, is what he says. And so, maybe perhaps he is in contrast to, the other Stoics. I don't know. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts.
It's really, just before I switched over to Adi, it's I really like that you pointed out Rufus, because Rufus is not usually pointed out in Stoic discussions. He's usually the odd man of the late Stoic for out that people tend to ignore. But I think he's one of the most important. He taught Epictetus, and I think there's, as far as I was reading this introduction to his lectures and fragments, they describe him as like a Roman Socrates. That's how important they're coming to think of him as in that time frame. He was extreme. I think, as opposed to like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and even Epictetus, apparently he's a bit more rough around the edges of a kind of Stoic than the others. And so if he had a very strict or interpretation of Stoic doctrine, that makes complete sense. Adi.
Oh, and then also the question about where is it reference the idea that you can have externals you prefer to have but are not attached to?
I didn't understand the question.
So you brought up the concept that you can have externals you prefer, right? But not necessarily that you're attached to. I'm just wondering, like, what Stoic talked about that, or like where does that come from? Because I'd be curious to read more about that.
Okay. I don't understand. I don't know specifically if there's a Stoic that, from what I've read, that specifically says explicitly states the sentence, there is a difference between preference and attachment, but they always tell you to never get attached to things, to external to yourself and outside of your power. At the same time, they also tell you in other passages that there are indifferents external to us that you can prefer, but nonetheless that you shouldn't get upset about, like you shouldn't get a passion, one of these next negative emotions about if it doesn't go your way. So they don't explicitly say there's a difference, but the way they define or explain each, that there is just a difference. They don't, they do, Epictetus does a good job, I think, of giving some examples. In his discourses, he often gives examples of people like at a dinner party. I think there's one example where he, you're sitting at a dinner table at a banquet and the food is coming around and you prefer to have one of the foods, but the way in which you're not attached to it is that if the food never gets around to you, you shouldn't get upset about it. It never came around to you. Maybe it did, but the bowl is empty now. It came around everybody else first. Just don't worry about it and enjoy the rest of the food. And if you can enjoy the rest of the banquet and enjoy the rest of the food, then you know you're preferring that food that was empty, but that you were never attached to it. That I think, if that explains it well, that's a good example that he gives.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, discourses, if you wanted to read more, his book 1 specifically talks about desire and attachment. Adi.
So I think for me, I mean, the way I see the key distinction is the desire and the attachment is, first, desire can be a thought, and the attachment is the degree of it, like how much you want it, and it's more like in the direction of action. So you can have several thoughts, you don't have to control them, or you may not have the entire the control on your thoughts, but you could definitely control your actions. So I guess the level of attachment you have, or the degree of attachment you have for a certain desire, I think that determines, I think that's the one which distinguishes. I see preference is a very, very like a thought, like you like something, but what you would do to get it determines how much attached you are. So I see the distinction is in the degree of your wantingness, or so it provokes action. So I think that determines how like what kind of actions you do. And I think that's also related to your virtues. I think if it's something your virtues suggest that it's a good action, then I think you do it, and you're following in the direction, or kind of right direction. But if it's something not a desire, or not in right order or right way, then I think, yeah. So I just see it as a degree of intensity.
That's also, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's it. So I see one as a thought, the other one as an action, and actions are the ones which have consequences. So yeah, that's how I see. I think that's, to me, the key distinction between choice, preference, and attachment, and desire. Yeah.
No, thank you, Adi. I really like that you brought that up too, that the Stoics really went to bat to keep explaining the fact that these desires, these attachments, these preferences are really just thoughts or beliefs you have, that they're not like in attachment is kind of like a mental relationship you have with something external to yourself. But it's only mental, right? You don't literally or physically have a relationship with something else, but you only have a mental one, because you yourself are in your own body. And so it's really important that, like the Stoics always said, the reason why you can control your attachments and, like you said, maybe lessen the degree to that which it's only a preference is because it's only a belief or a thought, and you can manipulate those.
But usually thoughts, there are several thoughts which don't result in actions, but I think if these thoughts result in a certain action, I think that's when your virtues come into a picture. Like is it a good or a bad? I think that's when. But as such, desires or thoughts or preferences are not. I don't think they are good or bad as such. But the definitely the things which follows them definitely has a.
That's no, you make a good point. Also, like I think when you're saying if an action results from an attachment, then you know it's an attachment. And I think what you mean, because there are, let's say, actions we can take that were premeditated. So we thought them out, we planned them out. But I think the actions you're talking about are kind of those impulsive actions.
Yeah.
If you have an attachment, you just go after it or something without thinking.
I think that depends on the level of attachment or the amount of. The amount of desire you have, I guess. If it's like an extreme attachment, then I think, it can result in extreme actions. It can sometimes lead to be good results, or at the end, it's also something. But I think suppressing your preferences or desires is not something which is suggested, but actions or your attachment definitely can be altered or controlled. I think you can definitely reduce the level of your attachments, maybe. That can be done. But desires or thoughts, I don't think you want to control them, or at least suppress them.
Paul.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. And I just want to make sure that I answer appropriately your question. So your question was, my daily life, how I see attachment.
Yeah, how would you explain attachment related to your personal experiences?
When I was an undergraduate student, I was like moving, 5 years. So I moved at least 6 times. And every time I had more and more things from my parents who intended on bestowing upon me all of the things that I used to use as a teenager, and I never used it anymore, really. Then I was a graduate student, I was a postdoc, and I moved probably 10 times in my life. And now, since a while, I try to just minimize everything that I actually have. And it's not that I read a book on minimalism or, Japanese art of decluttering, although I know a thing or two about it, but it's not like I read a blog post and now I want to introduce it. It's just, I thought a bit deeper about this. I don't need these many spoons and things in my kitchen, and I just don't want to have anything, just the bare minimum. So, I mean, I like my Thermomix in my kitchen, so this I could probably move with to my next apartment, but otherwise I don't want anything else, just a handful of items, really. So I think this has helped me, like the universe has created a situation where I'm no longer attached to things because I moved so many times since, I don't know, about a decade and a half. So this is how I would see it and how I would probably explain it to somebody else in a very, naive allegory, so to speak. I hope it makes sense.
No, it does. I'm trying to figure out things in my life now that maybe I've become over time detached to. But then I wonder if I'm mistaking simple detachment from de-novelty. Like if it's only a matter of I've become so used to it that it's boring or not a novelty to me anymore. But because I feel like that's also kind of a trap where, like, if you think you become attached to many things in your household because they're no longer new to you, then you could easily get attached to other things that are new for your household. But it doesn't sound like that, because it sounds like it's become more of a universal, long-lasting change in your household. So. Gonzalo and then Alvaro.
For me, I will say that it's kind of like I don't distinguish. I distinguish the amount of desire in order to say whether if I'm attached to something, or it's just nice to have, or a preference, or it's something that kind of like I have workarounds for that, or something like that. Kind of like for example, my legs. I cannot imagine my world without my legs currently. I mean, I can think about them, about what it will be not having them, but I cannot kind of like achieve that yet, because I haven't lived through that experience, right, of not having my legs. So kind of like in my process about the things that I'm attached to, it's like the requirements that I need to fulfill that thing will kind of like give me a clue about my inner thoughts about the thing that I'm attached to. Oh, that's really weird and confusing. Wait. Let me see if I can explain a little bit better. I see attachments as requirement, things that I think that I cannot live or do or work without them, let's say, or function more generally. For preference, it's like, I don't know, in my case, I can only think in food, kind of like a potato peeler. For me, it's a nice to have. I can peel a potato with a knife, but a potato peeler, it's a really good tool to have. But I only need a knife. So kind of like, it's about the ability for doing the things that I want, and kind of like my requirement or desirable position inside that list is what determines for me this preference or this preference.
That makes that's another good interpretation. I'm also just thinking, like, I'm speaking of legs, like I run, and on a twice or 3 times a week basis, and if I lost my legs, that whole part of my life is gone. So yeah, I think it's really interesting when you examine the things that you need to achieve your goals. Those things required for those goals are usually the things we become attached to. And then, but I don't think that's I like the way you frame that, because then we know where to look for attachments, or we know where we're likely to be attached to things. And I think it's also good to keep in mind, though, I think, not to make a conclusion from that we should get rid of all those things, or we should, well, why would you want to get rid of your legs? or become...
No, but kind of like more in the sense that it's an illusion that I need that for my everyday life. It makes things a little bit more complicated, or maybe I have to find new ways of exercising now. There are not running, despite the fact that I do not run. But okay, kind of like you need to. I think that's the flexibility that the Stoics are talking about in relationship to your thoughts. It's like you think that you need your legs, but until you're not tested that way and evolve from the point of I cannot do this without my legs to the point of, oh, I'm doing it without my legs. That's the Stoic process of following through, trying to develop your virtues. There you go.
It's a really neat trick too. You mentioned that variety can help us out. Is like, as long as if I'm working out or exercising, then maybe giving myself a variety of ways in which to do that, using different tools or body parts, can help me understand that not any one of those things that I'm using is necessary, because there's always an alternative, which is really smart, giving yourself an alternative. I remember last year, just before I bounced off 12 Faro, there was one really, it felt tragic at the time. This is before I started really practicing Stoicism. And it was the last few months of the school year, first few months of the pandemic. And my computer crashed. This is not the same computer. A computer crashed. And as a teacher, I cannot, like, with online lessons, I need that. So I started using my phone before I could get a new computer. For like, so the next few weeks, I just used my phone. I wrote emails, I messaged students, I video conferenced with students. I taught students using my phone because we couldn't go into the school for like a month. We had to do this from home. So like nowadays, I'm much more comfortable if my computer needs to go in for repair to use some alternative. I think now I need to, perhaps buy a tablet or something just in the event. But at least I know that I feel comfortable using my phone as an alternative. Alvaro.
Yeah, I just wanted to give my thoughts on the writing. I don't know if I'm steering the conversation in a different direction, but I do feel that the passage shared is very loaded, and a lot of it has relation to things that are very deep within Stoic philosophy. Basically, it's epistemology. So when we're talking about things such as hindrance, desire, aversion, these terms within Stoicism have a very specific meaning. So not being an expert on it, I'm just gonna give my thought about the passage and maybe use the concept of forgiveness, which is the one that I had brought up originally. Maybe I'm misusing it, but I will ask you to bear with me.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely bring it up.
So, for example, using the idea of forgiveness, I can read the first sentence as saying, "It was fit to be so. That which is best of all and supreme over all is the only thing which the gods have placed in our power." So, assuming forgiveness is a virtue, I do say that's virtues, but I don't know if forgiveness is a virtue, formally speaking, within Stoic philosophy. I feel that what this passage is communicating is that the gods or God has given us power, or nature, or nature has given us power to forgive if we want to. And I am a little bit puzzled by this sentence because my understanding is that Epictetus didn't believe in God, yet he mentions or gods. I'm puzzled that he didn't mention nature, but gods. But the idea is that virtue is the highest good, forgiveness is virtues, and virtuousness is also happiness within the context of Stoicism. So we have the power to be happy, we have the power to pursue that which is virtues. Then it speaks about appearances, which based on the discussion we're having, I was puzzled by it also because it seems to me that we're just reaching a conclusion which is like very religious, right? Maybe thinking in terms of, if we do some votes of poverty or something of that sort, we're maybe conducting ourselves in a good manner. But I was puzzled by the term appearances because I was like, why he's mentioning the right use of appearances? That sounds very shallow when he refers to appearances. But Stoicism also makes a lot of emphasis when it comes to determining what is true versus false. And I think the idea of appearances here is not so much how we're portraying ourselves before people, but determining that which is true. So we know for a fact that being virtuous is happiness. And if that's the understanding we have, the appearance that we have, then we're being happy. And then I think what Epictetus is implying in the last sentence is that even though it's worded differently, my understanding is that basically this will help you be free from any hindrance and avoid help you avoid anything you have to avoid. And he uses the terms desire and aversion. And that basically, I think basically Epictetus is saying, I have reached that point and therefore I'm ready to die.
I have what? And then I'm ready to die? What was the just part?
So I have basically reached that point, that stage in which, I'm free from any hindrance and I'm free from anything that I should avoid. Therefore, quote unquote, I'm virtuous, so I'm ready to die. There is nothing else for me to reach. or to be reached?
Yeah, I mean, to respond to a couple of things in there. So yeah, he did believe in God. The Stoics did have a belief in God. It was a bit different because they thought God was part of nature. So it was a different kind of God than the monotheistic religions of today. But they did. No, you're absolutely right, the interpretation. So, I mean, in one case, yeah, he is saying that you shouldn't have to die, right, when you achieve this mastery over desire and aversion. But nevertheless, it's something you should achieve before the end of your lifetime, is what he's saying. So that if you happen to die, you know, for him anyway, he's okay dying because he's become a better person, you know, over these desires and attachments. You're also absolutely right when you say that the Stoics thought the greatest power we have is the right use of appearances, specifically because we could determine, especially today with the scientific and philosophical tools we have today, that we can determine what's true or false when judging appearances. Yeah, and then ultimately going back to your idea of forgiveness, I mean, yes, forgiveness wasn't a virtue, wasn't the four main virtues of the Stoics, but forgiveness is a type of detachment. I was meditating on this before when you mentioned to talk about this in the discussion. I think it fits very nicely. This is why I thought it was a good broad topic to discuss, that forgiveness is a kind of detachment from grudges, from emotional attachments you have towards other people. In a very specific way, right? And forgiveness is that kind of detachment from grudges or ill will towards other people. And I think it fits very perfectly with what we're talking about, that in order to achieve virtue, you must begin by mastering desire and aversion. And to do so, you can use your power to understand things external to yourself, their appearances. You can judge if they're illusions, like attachments and some desires, like, for example, forgiveness, and then detach from them and start acting more in accordance with reason and virtue. So I think this all ties in very nicely together, and forgiveness has a big part of it, especially when it comes to like interpersonal relationships. Let me know if I misinterpreted what you said, but I think I wanted to hit all the points.
No, you're spot on, and thanks for even phrasing it better than I did. The only objection that I have, not from what you said, but from the passage itself, and where I was hoping this meeting could focus on, is on how to achieve that, because even though Stoicism is a philosophy, it does feel very much as a religion in this sense. Like when Epictetus is saying, "I'm ready to die," it sounds like, okay, you have reached perfection, so you're ready to go to a better world. You do not belong to this world. You are, you have achieved an illumination stage or whatnot, in which you're better than most of us at this point. So the idea is, for the rest of us, mere mortals, more mundane people, how do we cope with achieving that also, right? How do we achieve it? And even for those who do not wish to be perfect, right? I guess the term virtues to me is better than thinking about reaching perfection or reaching illumination or even reaching salvation, if you want to frame it within the Christian canon. It brings it more down to earth. But in this specific circumstance, I cannot help but to equate virtuousness with perfection and so on. And I find it really hard.
No, I'm gonna skip on to the two of us who've raised their hand, but just before, don't worry about being perfect. Like the Stoics thought that there was no such person. They thought that the sage was a role model, but nobody that you can really achieve. And because perfection isn't really achievable in an ideal way, you shouldn't make that your goal. Your goal is to practice virtue and practice having good character, not achieving it. I think that's also a good transition of focus. Don't focus on achieving the state of perfect virtue and character. Just focus on practicing virtue and good character in the moment. Over the lifetime, you'll probably see it accumulate in a good way in your life, but making it a goal, I think, is unstoic, because for them it would be beyond expectations and beyond things in your power. Oh, I know Gonzalo raised his hand. Yeah, I know you raised your hand first. I wanted to go over to the other person who's raised their hand. Is that Harita? Oh, your microphone is muted.
Hi, yes, it's Harita.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, thanks. I initially wanted to say something related to attachment and preference before, but I really liked the discussion Alvaro and you were having related to attachment, detachment, and how it can be practiced in normal life. This is also something that is really interesting, because once we attach ourselves to something, it becomes like a fixed parameter, and it's then quite difficult to detach from it when things don't go the way that we want. And oftentimes we don't realize when we attach ourselves to something that certain things are not under our control, and then it becomes difficult to let go of it or to detach afterwards. So this aspect of indifference, or this attitude of indifference towards normal everyday life, is quite challenging, and also it comes at a cost of something. So we cannot be, if it was easy, then everybody would be doing it. But the fact that we if we would like to live a stoic life with the ease of attachment and detachment of things, and having the big overview of certain things which are not under our control, it also to a certain extent defines who we are and how we are perceived from the outer world. So this indifference comes then at a cost of maybe not having close friends who we can share these beliefs or virtues with, or at the cost of, I don't know, not living in a city which we would like, because of certain things we attach to are somewhere else at the end of the world, just for example. So it is quite challenging to follow this principle. So I only remember what my grandfather, for example, used to say. He, even though family was a really important thing, he would always quote this, that I'm leading my life like a drop of water on a lotus leaf. So if I want, I can just roll off. I will be detached, So not for all people this comes, it's as a given, because there are other stimuli which can deviate, or these preferences which then take over as an attachment, which are normally only to be considered as a variable. So from my point of view, I think this is attachment, detachment are like something fixed, maybe long term, and preferences and desire, they come and go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's also probably would be great at this point, about a little more than halfway in the discussion, to transition to that point, like where we start talking about maybe solution is a very strong word, but techniques or strategies we can combat detachment, or we can help ourselves not become so attached to things that they upset or disrupt our lives. Actually, a good perfect timing to transition to Gonzalo, because I remember he just mentioned before, like a good way to maybe practice detaching yourself from things is like making alternatives for yourself. Like maybe a good example was like, I like riding my bike to work, but when there's an opportunity I can't, because my bike is in the shop where it's raining out, and don't want to ride my bike, then using the train or an alternative way of getting to work. But not just doing it in those times when like I can't ride my bike. I should even use those alternatives when I can perfectly use my bike, because the idea is to also prepare yourself for the time at which you can't use the one thing you thought was necessary in your life. I think that's also important, that we practice alternatives. Don't just reserve them for the times we need them. Gonzalo.
I kind of like the thing that I wanted, it's a small exercise for the first part that I think that the quote that Steve shared kind of like refers to. Kind of like, what's the right use of appearances, right? This is an exercise that my Zen teacher made, and kind of like it blew my mind at the beginning. He showed me something really similar to this, and he asked me to describe it. How can you describe this thing? It's like a reflection, right? Or at least from this side that you can see, it's of course it's a light, spoiler alert, but kind of like the thing that you can see from this side is that it's a reflected surface, right? And it's right now it is not on, but if I turn it on, it's bright or not or whatever. But that's not the thing that I'm actually seeing. This is what you are seeing. What I'm seeing is this thing. Even when the light is turned on, I can only see a black thing right there. Correct? Wait, I'm blinding myself. My example is backfiring on me. So what he tried to say is that anything that you kind of like crosses your path has these properties. They have a lot of different ways that you can perceive it. And you may be only seeing one of those. And of course, there are more possibilities than just one. And then you should try to redirect your mind towards flexibility of that. Kind of like anything that you perceive can have multiple aspects that your own. My internet is dying, I think. Am I?
You're still we still hear you. We see you.
Okay. So kind of like that flexibility of saying, I'm ignorant, or I have absolutely no idea related to this. I might only be able to see one small portion of it. Helps me, at least to me, to say like, oh, whenever I, let's say, meet a person that does some sort of harm to me, I try to evaluate if that harm that I'm perceiving was their core intention or not. Was it doing like on purpose, trying to harm myself, or was it actually it was a consequence of something that the other person didn't see because of their own ignorance? And whenever you kind of like start reframing things in this particular way, you start seeing that kind of like compassion is a natural thing for all the ignorance, and we are all ignorance. You cannot, let's say, put this pressure on another person to be perfect and expect that you left out of a situation unharmed when the other person is as ignorant as you. Kind of like that helps me also create this small space, let's say, of conversations in which kind of like I tend to ask, what are the expected outcome that you were wanting it, what you were searching on, and kind of like I try to develop those points instead of focusing on the, let's say, I don't know, another car crashed me because they couldn't see me on my bike. I don't kind of like immediately focus on my pain and how the other person is responsible for my pain. I think like, oh wow, they must be, I don't know, really focus on something else, having a lot of other problems in order to not have seen me. I think that that's kind of like a small tangent of how forgiveness works inside my mind.
I really like how you went back to the original beginning of his quote too. The fact that you put this in context of appearances, because, and I really like the exercise of just taking your time to look at a specific thing in your household, anything normal, and then looking at one side and then turning it around to look at it another. Because the idea is to look at the many dimensions of it. What you're talking about reminds me of, and I can't copy and paste the quote. I'll just post where I got it from. But it's a quote from Marcus Aurelius' Meditations in Book 3, Part 11, like section 11. He says something very similar to what you're saying in your practice in Zen. Always make a definition or sketch of what presents itself to your mind, so you can see it stripped bare to its essential nature and identify it clearly in whole and all its parts. Nothing is so conducive to greatness of mind as the ability to subject each element of our experience in life to methodical and truthful examination. He says it very elegantly, at least this translation does. But I think basically what he's also saying is something very similar to the technique you're using, is that when you look at something, don't just take it for granted. Examine it from all sides and break it down. What is it and what is it composed of? And I think these two different ways of looking at the same technique do a good job of basically reducing your attachments to what they purely are. If you're attached to something, maybe I say too many examples and then I run out of them, but if you're attached to something and then you break it down to an extent to which it appears like it's just a composition of different little parts, then you have no worries about it.
It's a little bit dangerous because you might have your own kind of like, how it's called, biases. Like, for example, I don't know, if you start decomposing your attachment to a friend, that can be a little bit difficult and harsh sometimes to do. It's like, oh, are these only hormones and, I don't know, booze or play games or whatever? Is it just that thing that it's kind of like creating my attachment to this other human? When in reality, sometimes there are kind of like, that's why I always leave room for a part of my ignorance. It's maybe that there's a bunch of things that I'm not seeing right now. And it's also okay to live with that. I want to use the word huge space of things that I have absolutely no idea what they are.
Yeah, I was also thinking of a counter argument to this, that you could another way to see it is that it could backfire is if you get curious about the thing you're examining too much. Like, for example, if you're really curious about something, but you're attached to it, it's been in your house, you can't live without, it'd be a tragedy if you lost it. But then if you decompose it and you get awed by it, you get wondered by it, you get really intrigued by what it's made out of, and physically or abstractly, and you could inadvertently get more attached to it because you dissect it so much that you're interested about it now more.
You're now obsessed about it.
Yeah.
But you're basically not doing anything with that thing that you're kind of like obsessed about it. It's just like, I'm obsessed by watching this, I don't know, fancy thing, but I'm not going to work or practicing my, I don't know, humble or anything. I'm just obsessed with that thing. I'm frozen, let's say, by that thing. So kind of like, I also see it that way. If something it's kind of like freezing you into, I don't know, a 10-hour Netflix session, then you probably should try to force yourself to do something else.
So let's see, we have in our toolbox for detachment, we have practicing alternatives, we can call them, right? Practicing alternatives. We have this method of decomposition. And I think also a good practice of ignorance, healthy ignorance, not so much that you don't believe anything, but healthy dose of ignorance. interesting connection, but just before I switch to Alvaro, is if anybody didn't realize what the picture of is on the meetup event page for this event, it's the ruins of a temple of Apollo at Delphi. And the reason why I put that on there is because it had certain inscriptions on it that were very key to understanding the Stoic philosophy. And the third inscription on the temple was this. I'll put it in the chat. It roughly translates to surety brings ruin. It basically tells you to basically reserve a healthy dose of skepticism. Not all the Greeks were skeptics in that true sense, so I don't think this is implying skepticism, but it's acknowledging that healthy dose of let's not call it ignorance. I think that's maybe a strong word for the Greeks, but in their words, maybe the idea is not to assent to something before you understand it at a deeper level. I think that's the Stoics would use the word assent. Don't reserve your assent for something before you get to know it a bit better.
Sorry, I'm not understanding that last word. Assent? Accent? Can you type it out?
Assent.
Okay.
Like to agree to something. Alvaro.
I follow what Gonzalo is saying, and I think it's very much in line with Stoicism. I just wanted to bring up the example or the case of Epictetus himself. And a lot of the criticism that Stoicism receives today is that many people see Stoicism as condoning slavery. Now, Epictetus was a slave himself. And I think if we look at his case, it is not debatable that he was a slave and that he was oppressed as a slave. Certainly, he chose an approach that was very much internal when handling oppression. But my point is that there are many cases in which debating how you're interpreting events, you can put aside that discussion. You can certainly see that there are cases in which there is oppression and other forms of injustice. And if everybody's taking an approach as the one of Epictetus, or had taken an approach as the one of Epictetus, maybe we will still be facing in society many of the wrongdoings that we faced in the past. And as a matter of fact, we still face many wrongdoings. So my question is, how do you balance this philosophy with the idea of we need to attain justice, we need to move forward, and with the thirst that we as humans have for action towards those injustices and retribution, and in a way that is sometimes very different to how Stoics will approach it.
Thank you. Gonzalo.
I want to bring a personal story about this, and it will sound really weird, and you probably think that I'm crazy, but that's how it went. A few years ago, 4 years ago, I was stabbed in Mexico. I was going out of cinema, trying to get into a cab. A person stopped in front of me and asked me to give them my phone. I have absolutely no idea why. I said, I'm not understanding what you're asking because this is my phone. Which is kind of like the way that I reacted, correct? This made the other person in front of me really mad at me and start to chase me with the knife. Eventually, after a little fighting, that's the way that I reacted, he got to stab me twice, right? One on the side and the other one on my back. The first thing that I actually thought about him stabbing me was not angry. Because I was understanding that one, he was drunk or maybe abusing some other substance. Second, the fact that maybe, I don't know, he was poor. That's the only way that he thought about the way that the world worked. And by a really bad luck, I was the person that got stabbed. But also, by a really good luck, I also got stabbed because nothing happened to me. I was wearing something new that I bought that it's like how do you say jacket that had like a fabric on top that kind of like that the thing that got damaged and not the fabric. So I was really lucky because nobody got hurt. Kind of like besides my scars, let's say, I just went to the hospital, paid the medical bill, and everything is fine. But I'm not holding a grudge to that person, even though it caused me some harm, right? I know that that's the hard part, because probably most people will start to kind of like, I could have died right there, and probably, I don't know, become hippie or something. But my idea was, okay, so I have action to, let's say, I have a choice about the thing that happened to me, right? I can choose what to do with it. I can either react by pursuing this person and trying to kill him because he made me feel some pain. But what will be the correct way of doing it? Should I consider all these things that happened to him as things that bring them bad luck and hence allow them to react that way? Or should I not consider them and judge him as if it was like a perfect human being, that one that doesn't make mistakes, or I don't know, doesn't get high and lost themselves in drugs? What will be my level of compassion regarding to that human, and how will be the best way of me helping them or any other person? So I kind of like, that's my way of seeing things. It's a little extreme, to be honest. My psychologist is not really happy about it, but kind of like, that's the way that I see that the world becomes a better place, by me saying like, okay, the violence stop with me. If you send me violence, I will not send violence back. I will send other things, maybe food. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. No, I don't think. I think it's also quite interesting that your psychologist doesn't think that's I guess they would say, not a healthy reaction to what happened, because even on a larger scale, you hear about there was several years ago a famous terrorist that was captured in Sweden. They were never given the death penalty, and they were given the same rights and same conditions to live under as all the other prisoners in the country. And the way in which their prison system or criminal justice system works is that they really, really focus, contrary to Germany and especially contrary to some place like the US, they focus on rehabilitation and recuperation. So they give them standard living quarters with obvious security, but they don't give them the typical jail bars and concrete walls. Perhaps some of the facilities are made of concrete, but you get what I'm saying. And there's a famous instance when the judge went up to the terrorist who attacked and killed several people in the courtroom, and he shook his hand. He was shaking hands with all the other prosecutors and lawyers, and then he shook his hand too, because he didn't want to make an excuse this one time for this one person. He wanted to treat everybody like a human being, regardless. And I think it comes from that same philosophy that you can't consider this person evil, at his roots. Maybe he did something evil, but that was a human being who did that. And if you want that human being, because any prison system that gives them worse conditions will ultimately probably come out in a worse condition. Just like how you were saying, if you treated that person with the same violence and aggression that they did, they probably would have come out just like that, instead of being a better person. But again, I like you said, this is also the way in which I would like to react to, or hope that most of society would react to situations like that.
Yeah, but what I'm also saying is that that's the way that I'm reacting, and it's okay if you react differently, because that's the human condition. You have either fight, fly, or freeze, and some of that thing will happen, and whatever happen, it's fine, let's say, because you are a human being, and there are some parts of you that are not completely under your control.
Jack.
Yeah, so coming back to the discussion about attachment and desire, I actually had a question. So a few days ago, I was in a book club with a couple of people. We were talking about this book, A New Earth, from Eckhart Tolle, and essentially the whole idea, it talks about ego and detachment and things like that. And during the course of the conversation, there's this girl there that she felt this whole concept of detachment was just not for her. Like, you know, she admitted being someone that, you know, doesn't necessarily, I guess, what would you call it?
Hedonistic?
Yeah, there you go. Hedonistic, right? And she completely admitted to like being and her point was that she enjoys wine. She enjoys, you know, some of the material aspects of life. And so we started talking back and forth, and I was like, so I made the point that you can enjoy things without being attached to them, right? That's the whole point of that, I think, of that book, and then perhaps some of the things that the Stoics are talking about. But and so we went back and forth for a while. But I guess, yeah, my question is, like, can you really enjoy wine, you know, while being detached to it? Because I remember, I forget exactly which Stoic said this. It was something along the lines of like, look at a cup of wine as just a cup of grapes, and like a steak as like a dead animal on a plate. And so I'm wondering if there's a danger to being detached, or the practice of detachment. You know, she brought up, I don't know if this is true or not. She read the book, The Lives of the Stoics, and perhaps one of the Stoics was fasting, and then after fasting for a period of time, when he ate again, he didn't really enjoy it, and so because of that, he ended up like starving himself to death or something along those lines. I don't know. Maybe some of you guys know that story, but yeah. So again, I guess, like, I feel that personally, I feel that you can enjoy aspects of life without necessarily being attached to them, but I wonder, yeah, is there a danger to detachment, or practicing detachment?
So that's a really good question. I want to answer Alvaro's first, because I don't want us to lose sight of the questions in the order in which we brought them up. So first, for Alvaro, quickly, I think the Stoics respond to things like slavery and other very apparent, for the Stoics, dispreferred indifference, or for society in general, what we would call societal evils, or ills. I think the Stoics would respond to them in the same way that they would respond to anything else external to what out of their personal and direct control, and that is that they can't control it, but they prefer slavery doesn't exist. I don't think there's a Stoic back then that would have dispreferred slavery to not exist. I think they all would have preferred slavery not to exist. The reason for Epictetus to focus so much on, he does give examples of him with his leg and him with his former master. The reason he gives examples about slavery is because he has to deal with it. Like, it's not something that he could get out of because he was a slave. So he had to cope with that. So it was, in a way, Stoicism was brought out of a response to slavery. or in the case of Zeno, for disaster, right, from a shipwreck. Like these things were born out of. So like shipwrecks and slavery should by far not the same thing, but they shouldn't happen. We don't prefer them to happen, but if they can't be helped, then we have to respond to them in a certain way. And that was all the Stoics, I think, would have said on that. I think if you're asking about would the Stoics have been passive? That is, let's say in today's world, would Stoics ever, let's say, organize to revolt against, let's say, a factory hiring children? I would say maybe yes. It's not out of the realm of examples that Stoics would do such a thing. It was Cato the Younger, and I bring this example up a lot because he's perhaps the best example to use, is that he was a Roman senator who literally for a few years was the general who took the Roman military against Caesar in the Civil War, like, because he thought that preserving the Republic against somebody who wanted to become emperor was a big enough deal that he should go to war against him. So if that tells you anything, then I think for the Stoics, there's nothing wrong with fighting for your ideals, and even to that extent. What matters is that you end up not causing yourself dismay at the fact that you maybe didn't succeed. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep going, but that you shouldn't disrupt your own personal life, especially your personal emotions, for the sake of not meeting your expectations, because then you would never be able to act with reason thereafter. The whole point of the Stoics for doing this was that they didn't want to react in a passionate or emotionally irrational way, such that they can't use their reason to act afterwards. So if that helps answer your question, at least that would be the way in which, and again, I'm just giving what I think the Stoics would respond to your question. As far as Jack's question goes, I think that's a really good time to bring up a quote that I wanted to bring up, because this quote basically gives an answer to Jack's question. That is there a downside to detachment, or perhaps extreme detachment? And let me bring it up. It was actually in one of the articles I posted called "The Meaning of Detachment in Taoism, Buddhism, and Stoicism." And it's the very first example. And I'll copy and paste it in the, actually, I can, yeah, I'll copy and paste it in the chat. That might be best. Okay. Long passage, but if you follow with me, so the whole article introduces this. It opens up with a scene from the summary of a movie called Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring. And it says, as the film begins this summer, a monk is shown raising a young boy, his protege. And the lessons the monk teaches the boy about his relationship to others concern childish cruelty to a fish, a snake, and a frog. No other people enter the picture. So there's no other people in this boy's life except this monk. Until the boy grows into a teenager and a young woman comes to the monastery to recover from illness. He discovers his sensuality and passion for her, but when his master discovers their relationship, she is sent away and he is warned about forming attachments. The boy leaves the monastery to pursue the girl and, unable to control his passion, kills her. Years later, the boy, now a sober and repentant man, returns to the monastery, and in summary, the whole cycle repeats again. If I think just that story itself is a good response to Jack's question, is there a downside to detachment? And there is. If this is the kind of detachment that you're interpreting, this extreme detachment from literally anything and anyone, you're no longer practicing Stoicism, you're practicing Epicureanism. It was the Epicureans who decidedly thought that one should reserve oneself to a solitary garden, maybe with a few other people who are meditating and practicing like you, and abstain from all social, political, or other participation because it would cause you suffering and harm and negative emotions. That's like an extreme form of detachment that the Stoics wouldn't agree with. I don't know. What do you guys think about this story and the conclusions you can draw from it? I think this is a perfect example of what Jack was speaking about. Yeah, Gonzalo.
Yeah, I actually was going to say something very similar to that. If you never, let's say, have been drunk, you have no idea what that is, and you have no idea what you're dealing with, and you cannot understand what's going on inside the mind of another drunk person, in the same sense that you don't understand what maybe it's the nice part about drinking alcohol and so on and so forth. Kind of like you cannot, for me, if you clean yourself from the attachment, but not from, let's say, by just removing something from your life, then you have absolutely no control to do when that thing is in your life now. Let's say that, I don't know, I'm obsessed with cookies and I remove all cookies from my house. I will not be able to eat any cookie inside my house because there are none. But in the outside world, there's a lot of cookies and I might want a cookie. I cannot understand that obsession without actually tasting a cookie. If you're raised without a cookie and then you try one, you can say, I don't know, this is the best thing that happened to me, and life, it's all about eating cookies. And you will be completely wrong. That's just one nice thing about life, when you can manage them all with the correct measure, let's say, or at least that's kind of like, or intensity, let's say. I'm not sure how to say that word, sorry.
Just to follow up real quick. So I mean, so this girl that I was talking to, her point was that the Stoics essentially can't truly enjoy things because of the concept of like, you know, the whole idea of detachment, and when it comes to, you know, indifference or things like that. And my response to her was, and I, you know, I don't know if I was correct or not in saying this, but essentially the idea is to find a kind of a balance of not being completely hedonistic, enjoying the pleasures life have to offer, but at the same time putting it in perspective. Would that be a correct view from the Stoics' perspective?
Yeah, and you kind of nailed what the Stoics were saying, because in one specific regard, you nailed it because you mentioned in moderation or in a balance. Because one of the Stoics' virtues being moderation or temperance, they thought that you, and actually one of the Temple of Apollo phrases, nothing in excess. You shouldn't go beyond moderate values or amounts of something, or expressions of something. And you can definitely enjoy it. Like if I wanted to go out with my friends and have a few drinks and enjoy that with them, that's perfectly fine. The idea is that I don't get so drunk. First of all, I don't get so drunk, and I think she would agree with this, that you end up perhaps becoming permanently addicted. You know, day after day, you want the next drink, and you end up getting addicted. And the other side of the coin, I think she would also maybe agree with the fact that you don't want to get so drunk as to put yourself in the hospital, right? You maybe you have even 7, 8, 10 beers, but if you know your body can take that and there's no harm in doing that, then by all means, right? I'm sure also this girl, and I believe most human beings, so even if they seem like it, they probably don't do these kinds of things as often as you think. Most people still like the times they have privately in their homes, not going out and doing anything like that. I think she would agree with that to an extent, and then you could. But again, and I saw your hand raised, so I'm going to go to Alvaro and then back to you, Jack. But I think also the Stoics would say it's up to you to decide. There's frequent times in the discourses for Epictetus when he says, don't ask me what you should do, ask yourself. Because while Epictetus gives recommendations, you're the only person who knows yourself. So you're the only person who knows your limits and the way in which you respond to things like alcohol, maybe other drugs or foods or things like that. So it's also based on context. If the girl has no problem going out for a few drinks 3 or 4 times a week with her friends and getting drunk, that's fine. If she's in her early 20s and she wants to stop that in her late 30s, maybe that's her way of living life. But that's her way of, if she can handle that and she can moderate the rest of her life aside that, then I think it's also important to note that Stoicism is not a doctrine that everybody must follow. It's just it's a choice of life. Alvaro, and then back to Jack.
Yes, I think you basically spoke what I wanted to say. I'm just gonna echo on that. I was gonna just highlight that I believe Stoicism, it has a very high standard. And we can even see it when we see the bios of the authors of the late Stoics. I mean, if we see Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, these are people who are in higher up places in government. And I guess most of us would hope that people who are governing others will live at very high standards, that they are not getting drunken before deciding to go to war or not, or passing policies or not. And I guess everybody, it's depending on their context and the life philosophy that they want to pursue or adopt. They must decide for themselves how high of standards they're going to have in their lives. But I believe that just beginning with the assumption that virtuousness is happiness, that's a very, very high standard. And some of them maybe did it because of the responsibilities that they had. And some others, like Epictetus, may pick up on the philosophy because they are part of the differentialized, the ones who are being oppressed. And that's a way to counter that. But I guess, yeah, going back to my previous questions and the previous discussion, I do believe that oftentimes we do feel like if we do not want to follow such a high standard, right? And we want to settle for less. Maybe we want to forgive, but not letting go completely, and so on. So yes.
No, thank you. And remember, Marcus Aurelius also liked to think about other people. If you think, you don't have to think of always an ideal or abstract example of perfect virtue and wisdom. You can also think of somebody else in your life who exhibits a good quality, one of your, somebody more practical. Jack, I saw your hand raised, put down. I don't know if you still wanted to say something.
No, it was pretty much covered with what you were saying, Steve. And no, I just appreciate everybody helping to answer my question. Thank you.
No, thank you guys. I think this is the time we're going to wrap up. I have to go. So just to conclude, a few remarks. First of all, thank you, everybody. This was a fantastic discussion, and we all had really good questions. This is a really good one. And I think we should do something like this again on desire and attachment. I think, though, it would be interesting if we keep doing this along each of the disciplines. Well, the next one would be discipline of action or assent. I have to look up which one Epictetus technically orders them in, but it would be good to kind of go along those lines. Just a note about schedule. So I'm back to school next week, and I cannot, it's very hard for me to do 2-3 meetings a week like we have been over the last few months, maybe aside from the summer break. And so Thursday next week, we're not going to have a meeting because I already scheduled something for Saturday next week. So not next Thursday, the 26th, but the 2nd of September is when we should have 2 weeks from now is when we should have a next Thursday discussion. The Saturday next week on the 28th is going to be in person. So just keep a lookout on the meetup schedule for that. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining. This was a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody has a good weekend, and I'll see everybody next time. Cheers,
Okay.
everybody.
See you
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.